and good afternoon. My name is Brittany McGee, and I'm the Assistant Director of Next Generation at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining us via Zoom for this important and timely discussion. We're delighted to host this online program for our Young Professionals Network of the Council, guests, and friends. The Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform. Thus, views expressed by individuals hosted here are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Please check the Council's website for upcoming programs and information on how you can support our organization through membership and giving. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for this afternoon's discussion. Devera Cohn serves as a senior writer and editor at Pew Research Center, covering the census, demographics, and immigration. She is an author of studies on marriage and birth rates in the United States, migration between the US and Mexico, and US population projections. Anita Banerjee is the director of the Democracy Initiative at Forefront, a social impact association based in Illinois. There, Anita leads Census 2020 outreach and civic engagement work throughout the state. Craig Kafura is the Assistant Director of Public Opinion and Foreign Policy at the Council. He coordinates work on the Council's annual public opinion poll and is a regular contributor to the Public Opinion and Foreign Policy blog, Running Numbers. Following our discussion, we'll be taking audience questions for our panel at ccga.live. If you'd like to ask a question, simply enter ccga.live into your browser. Follow the on-screen prompts, and you'll be able to submit or vote on your favorite question. Anita, Devera, and Craig, thanks so much for joining us. We're all looking forward to your thoughts and expertise.
Oh, thank you, Brittany, for that introduction. Devera, Anita, welcome to the Council's virtual stage. And I'm really excited today to talk about the 2020 census, what makes it different, what makes it important, and the challenges that it faces this year. Now, going into the 2020 census, I think there was already quite a bit of discussion about it and how things had changed since the 2010 census. Devera, why don't I start with you? What's changed since the 2010 census that makes the 2020 census different and maybe more important than the last one?
Well, certainly one big thing that everyone has been talking about lately is what is the impact is of the coronavirus on the census and its accuracy and completeness. There's a lot of concern that the virus will keep people indoors and not wanting to answer the door if census takers come. The Census Bureau already has shifted a lot of in-person events to online, and this is a kind of crucial time for them because this is the point at which they're trying to persuade the hardest to count Americans to respond. And in person has been shown to be a fairly effective way of doing that. So we'll see whether the online version works. So that's one thing. They've already delayed some of the start of their field operations because of the virus. But beyond that, so what's new about the census itself? Well, this is the first census in which most people are being asked to respond online. The Census Bureau is hoping that about a little more than half of people, somewhere between 55 and 60%, respond online to the census. It's one in which they're using a lot more automation and technology, from satellite imagery to check whether addresses have changed over time, that is, whether homes have been built or destroyed in compiling their address list, to handheld iPhones that the door knockers will use when they come to your door to follow up. All of that is new. What isn't there, that a lot of people think is, however, is a question on citizenship. Our own survey work has shown that most people think or don't know that citizenship is not asked. Only about 1 in 5 Americans knows that, but it's not going to be asked. And that's no different from past censuses, but a lot of people thought that there would be some differences. I could go on more. Certainly the nation has become more diverse since the 2010 census, and that's obviously has many favorable aspects to it, but in terms of taking the census, communities of color tend to be harder to count, and so that's a challenge for the census that has grown since 2010.
Anita, you're dealing with a lot of this right here in Chicago. How have you seen preparations for the 2020 census, and how has sort of the coronavirus thrown things for a bit of a loop?
Oh gosh. Illinois was kind of middle of the pack in 2010 in terms of self-response. So we had to activate early for the 2020 census. And in 2017, Forefront was fortunate to receive some funding to really coordinate across sectors, right? So bringing government together with philanthropy, together with the nonprofit sector, because we know that our trusted messengers are nonprofit community leaders. So we've worked long and hard to get to this spring. In 2018, Forefront launched the Illinois Count Me In 2020 program with a funders collaborative component and a nonprofit coalition. And it really kind of helped us set the stage for other local count committees to start popping up across the state, really reinforce the opportunity for us to work together. This issue is one in which I would argue we rise and fall together as a state. And so all of this work kind of came to a head, and literally we went live March the 12th, and then the coronavirus went live the next day. And it's been a real challenge. Certainly, as Devera mentioned, we already have so many challenges to the 2020 census. And now with the coronavirus, it's yet another barrier, if you will, to a fair and accurate count. But I will say that our grantees, our stakeholders, our advocates are really trying hard to bring it at a time when people's health and their families are of the first and foremost priority. And amidst these challenges, we see that Illinois is still strong, right? We're still holding in the top 10 across the country in terms of self-response, but we have a lot of work still to do in the city of Chicago and Cook County, not to mention a lot of our smaller counties across the southern region of our state.
So Anita, you mentioned that we do have some numbers on how Illinois and Chicago are doing so far. You mentioned we're in the top 10. How close to the top are we?
So I think right now we're trending at number 9, which is great for us because in 2010, I think we ended at number 11, which was with a number of other states. And this is important because the Midwest region is known for a fairly accurate count. Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, they always have really strong numbers. And Illinois, at a time when we have had considerable outward migration in the last 5 years alone, we really need our census data to provide for a better tomorrow. And the city of Chicago's numbers are just not there yet. You know, we really need to work together and collaboratively so that we can beef up those numbers in the next couple of months ahead.
Well, sticking on the numbers theme, Devera, you are the queen of census numbers when it comes to public opinion. What does the latest Pew Center research tell us about how Americans think about the census?
Right. So we've done a couple of surveys of adults in the U.S. The last one was late February, early March. So it was really just before mailings went out to most households, encouraging people to respond, and also before the coronavirus hit. And what we found was that Americans overwhelmingly know the census is coming, and for the most part are ready to participate, but there are some gaps in enthusiasm. The older you are, the more likely you are to say that you're going to participate, and the younger you are, the less likely. So for millennials, for example, they're less likely than boomers or others, Gen X folks, to say that they're definitely or probably going to participate in the census. People give a mix of reasons for being unsure whether they're going to participate, including concern about giving data to the government. But for a lot of people, it's they just don't know much about the census. And that makes sense for millennials, because certainly folks in their 20s may never have taken a census on their own. Their parents might have filled out the form for them, or they may have come from another country where they didn't have the same kind of census. So knowledge does play a role in people's willingness to participate. We also found, as I mentioned before, that most people don't know that the census doesn't ask about citizenship. Most don't know that it also doesn't ask about religion. And many people don't know that it's in the Constitution that the census must be taken, and that it's legally required to take the census, although the Census Bureau doesn't usually come in and try to run you down if you don't fill out your form. We also found that most people would like to take the census online, and that's especially true for millennials. It makes sense, more likely to be online than older generations. And millennials are also a little bit less optimistic than the population as a whole that the census will be accurate in conveying a full count of this country.
Anita, you must deal with a lot of these concerns from millennials, from minority groups about some of these questions, about some of these misperceptions about the census. How do you try to convince people that the census is important to them, convince people that this is really important to their communities?
Well, understanding that we're running a statewide program, it's been a work in progress to get communities all across the state to understand the importance of the census. And with millennials, that's no different. But what I would argue is that millennials have a real opportunity to lead on the census, a real opportunity to engage their families, their friends, their communities in a way that children that are younger cannot or don't. And that many millennials have siblings that are in that younger generation that need to be counted. And at a time when our civil liberties are at risk, right? We've got immigrant communities that can't vote. We've got ICE raids that are occurring all across the country. We've got this coronavirus that is bringing the issue of equality front and center in our society. Millennials have that opportunity to bring power back to communities. But certainly there are three main reasons why the census is important, right? It's our congressional representation. In Illinois, we've had one seat in Congress reduced every census cycle. So we used to have 24 members of Congress in 1950. We now have 18. Keeping with that trend, we're likely going to lose one congressional seat, right? And where is that going to come from? It's probably going to come from the central part of our state. But because of that outward migration we've had that I mentioned earlier, in the last 5 years alone, we're looking to lose a second. And if we want to be able to empower our millennials for the next generation, for them to be elected officials in the next decade ahead, we need to rely on getting everyone counted so that we keep our congressional representation intact. The second reason why the census is so important is our federal dollars, right? We need to rely on those necessary dollars for social service programs that residents all across the state utilize. I understand that for many millennials, this may not impact them, or they may not think it's impacting them on a day-to-day level. But you've certainly got grandparents or younger siblings or cousins that rely on social service programs. You've got neighbors, community members that need to rely on these necessary resources. And if we don't ensure for these federal dollars at a time when our state budget is always in crisis, we need these dollars for new roads, new schools, new bridges, new infrastructure to provide and incentivize for people to stay. And that leads me to my third reason why the census is so important, right? Is to incentivize and provide for a better tomorrow. And we simply cannot do that without accurate data. We can't provide for small businesses to grow and thrive without knowing where communities reside.
Thank you. Yes, those are all very, very critical reasons that all of you should fill out your census forms if you haven't already. In addition to reminding you of that, I want to remind you that in 15 minutes, we're going to take your questions and provide some answers. So if you have a question that you'd like to see answered, go to ccga.live.live and submit a question there, vote on others' questions, and we'll get to those around 3:30. Devera, Anita listed out a number of really major reasons that the census is important. Are people aware of some of these impacts of the census? Do they understand that it's not simply a way for the government to get basic information?
I think our survey work does show that people do know that the census, in general, know that it's used to divide up the seats in Congress and also has an impact on federal funding in their areas. And we find that people have differing ideas about whether the census will benefit them if they fill out their forms or benefit their communities. But there is actually fairly wide knowledge of the kind of the basics, at least, of what the census does. But, I would add that there's a lot more that I, as a researcher, take from the census. And to give an example from today's headlines, we don't know what disease rates are, for example, unless we have a good population count, because, constructing a rate means you have to know both how many people have some kind of disease or condition, which we're struggling with now with the coronavirus. But you also have to know how many people there are in any given group, older people, younger people, African Americans, and so forth, because we want to measure disparate impact. All of that comes from census numbers.
And speaking as a public opinion survey researcher, we need accurate census data so that we can weight our surveys properly. So we very much want everyone to complete the census ourselves, although that is a bit of a selfish reason, I admit. We've talked a little bit about sort of millennial attitudes on the census and understanding that millennials are less likely to take and complete the census maybe than older generations. But millennials are also a pretty diverse generation. I guess, Devera or Anita, what are some of the differences that we see within that large generation, different subgroups that maybe need a little bit of extra prompting? Are there specific areas of concern that are unique to millennials? All right, Devera, we'll go with you first.
I'll take a go at it. Certainly, this is not just true of millennials, but of all generations. The folks who are the best educated, the most established, the most well-off tend to be the ones who answer the census. And folks who are less well-established, who might be renting rather than owning their homes, who might not have a college education. In fact, those folks who actually have need of some of the programs whose dollars are distributed through federal funds that are allocated based in part on census numbers, those folks tend to be less likely to fill the census out. And there are some good reasons for that. People who are less sort of tied down and established, who might be more mobile and transient, might be not only less enthusiastic, but also might not get a census form in the mail because they might be moving around. So you depend on them being counted by others. And then there's one age group, not millennials, but the youngest children of millennials, who I think it's important to talk about. There's a big push this time with this census to count the youngest children, younger than 5. It turns out that the age group of 0 babies to 4 is the most undercounted age group in the census. There are lots of reasons for that, ranging from that sometimes people think children aren't counted in the census. Well, they are. Everybody is. Or some young children are part of families that might be very what are called complex. That is, there's a household owned by one couple, and maybe her sister, the wife's sister, has moved in for a few weeks while she's trying to get on her feet again after some kind of problem. And the couple that owns the house might not think to count the other family because, they're just here temporarily. But in fact, that family has to be counted somewhere. So the census form or the mailing actually includes some questions that the Census Bureau asks to try to establish whether somebody is part of that household or usually stays somewhere else. And they would, that's one technique they're using to try to make sure that everybody is counted, including these young kids.
Anita, how are you seeing that play out here in Illinois?
Yeah, 2 other things that I would mention is that the millennial generation typically derives their information from online sources, and in particular, social media. And when you think about the census always being predominantly a paper form that's filled out every 10 years, it comes to your mailbox. Millennials, as Devera mentioned, are often transient, and don't think to check their mailboxes, right? May not have filled out the form in the 2010 census. And so making that generation aware has been a bit of a challenge. Encouraging them to be the leaders for their communities, many of them that are part of communities of color. It is difficult when you're transient, not checking your mail, haven't filled out the form before, trying to understand the importance of it, particularly for our future. But I would also say that the immigrant communities, the undocumented communities, the mixed status families, these are communities that are traditionally undercounted, and we need for our millennials to ensure that all these households are accounted for. We need for them to recognize that their grandparent, their niece, their nephew that may be living with them. I am of an Asian American family, right? The Indian for millennials to say, hey, let's get everybody in the household counted.
So talking about some of the specific outreach efforts, Devera, earlier you mentioned that there were some misconceptions about the census in terms of citizenship questions about religion. Anita, how are you in Illinois trying to push back on some of those misconceptions to explain away some of those concerns to get that really full count you're looking for?
We're trying to explain that we have to work together, that we cannot provide for that better tomorrow if we're not collaborative. We're trying to explain that this impacts not just our future, but our daily lives, right? How do we set ourselves up for the next decade if we're not working hand in hand with government, with philanthropy, with nonprofits? So an example I would give is that there's a really great organization called the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus that is bringing together all local area governments, right, from county to village to township, and they're really pulling on the strength of these leaders that are of the millennial generation, right, to say that this is our opportunity to count, right, that this is a civic duty. And at a time when we're amidst these elections and so many people can't vote or don't vote, this is a way to count. This is a way to matter. And we've seen the strength right now when you think about the fact that the census may need to be extended. And we have a 2-week extension, but we could certainly use more time. Time could really aid in a more accurate count, although there are folks that may say the further you get away from April 1st, the harder it is to get the count. But I would say we are in extraordinary circumstances, unprecedented times, that if we have that opportunity to connect and convene this summer, late summer, to be in person to get that word out, we could really make that difference.
Devera, we've talked a lot about millennials this afternoon so far, but of course, millennials won't be the youngest generation counted in the census. That will be Gen Z. Do we know much about Gen Z's views on the census? Do we know how they'll be, how their completion rates are looking so far?
The Census Bureau does not have participation rates by age. It's all by geography. So you could, I suppose, look at neighborhoods that have large numbers of Gen Z folks in them and see whether how they're responding. But I'm not aware that that's been done yet. But we do know that our survey had we can't say a lot about Gen Z from our survey. We didn't have a huge sample, but in general, the older you are, the more likely you are to say you know about the census and you intend to participate and so forth. And the younger you are as an adult, the less likely you are. So there are some concerns, will the Gen Z folks participate? Now, a lot of them are in the college age. And that's posed a real interesting situation this time. Again, back to coronavirus, with colleges closing their doors, a lot of college students have been sent wherever, back to their parents or to some new address. Well, a lot of people don't know that when you're living in a college dorm or an off-campus housing situation at a college, that's where you're supposed to be counted. You're not supposed to be counted at your parents' house unless you're actually living with them while you're at college. And even in the best of times, parents don't always know that. They think, hey, this is my kid. I'm paying tuition. They're still under my control. I get to count them on my census form. This time, though, these students are supposed to be counted where they normally live. The Census Bureau put out a specific advisory on that, said if you've been sent away or you're on leave even unexpectedly from college, still count yourself where you're usually supposed to be. And so colleges do a lot of that work themselves. They provide lists to the Census Bureau. But if there are students who are living in off-campus housing who normally count themselves there, they should count themselves there and not where they're moving temporarily.
Anita, I'm sure that must have thrown another sort of wrench your way, as not only are you grappling with coronavirus, but now you're grappling with large populations moving back home. Has there been any specific outreach in Illinois to try to connect with these college students who have now moved from campus back home and to make sure that they're counted properly?
Yes, so we have heard that the Regional Census Bureau is working with all of the various administrations at higher institutions across the state to ensure that they're getting messaging out to the students that lived off campus, encouraging them to go online and fill out the census with without a unique ID, right? So making sure that they use the address that they lived at when they were on campus. But we've got grantees and organizations that we've provided a lot of guidance to regarding that messaging. So working with our national advocates, working with some of our local advocates to make sure that we're putting together PSAs, videos, fact sheets, sharing information. There's a group called Campus Compact that works with higher ed institutions all across the state, making sure we're working with our local partners like UIC, University of Illinois at Chicago, to get that messaging out. Certainly, this is more complicated, but we know that students that live at universities off campus are a hard to count population in theory, right? And that is really playing out in real time amidst this virus.
One more time, I want to remind the audience that we are about to go to Q&A. If you have a question, please put it in at ccga.live. And I guess my last question before we turn it over to the group, Devera, we know a lot, we've talked a lot about the US Census, but the US is not the only country that performs a census, not the only country that counts its populations. Is the US Census unique in some way? Are there ways that the US Census is particularly different from others around the world?
Well, the U.S. was the first nation to conduct a kind of a modern census of its population, and some aspects of the U.S. Census are different. And let me dwell on one of them because that may be changing. When we look over to some of the counterpart countries in Europe and Scandinavia, for example, what they will often do, many of them, in counting their population is rely on what's called a population register. And when you're born, your name gets entered into a database. When you move, your name gets entered into a database. If you immigrate into the country or leave, you're either included or taken out of that database. And of course, when you die, your status changes as well. And these countries use records, essentially government records and other records, to count their populations. It's, I guess, historically, it's a hand-me-down from the era when one had church records of all kinds, from births to baptisms and so forth. Well, the U.S. Census hasn't done that. We don't have that kind of national database, but the census is moving in that direction. This time, they're going to be making much more expanded use of what's called administrative records, which is other kind of government records, be it from the IRS or immigration, Social Security, to fill in missing data when people don't respond to the census. And also, even though there's no citizenship question, the president has ordered the government to assemble a database the citizenship status of every American, and that's going to be based on other government records. So the U.S. is edging over in that direction, and we'll see whether that becomes more and more the way to conduct a census as people increasingly are reluctant to fill out forms or answer their doors to census takers.
A good reminder that everyone should go out and fill out their census forms. I'm going to move to Q&A. Again, if you'd like to submit a question, you can do so at ccga.live. Our top question I'm going to direct to you, Anita, and the question is, which populations seem to be the most underrepresented in terms of census participation, and what efforts can be done to increase that participation?
That is an excellent question. I would say certainly we have to reach out to our communities of color. We have to get to our seniors, our disabilities communities, our renters, our children 0 to 5 population within these communities of color. Our African American communities on the southwest sides of the city, of Cook County, our rural communities, the communities of color that reside in central and southern Illinois, the Latino population, that 40% of our Illinois population has exploded with this community alone, and we need to ensure that these communities are getting counted. And so we are looking to our trusted leaders at organizations like MALDEF, the Latino Policy Forum, the Illinois Coalition on Immigrant and Refugee Rights, to help us get to these various communities. We've got an Illinois Complete Count Commission, the first of its kind in the country, that was created in 2018 by state statute, that allows for 22 members from across the state to come together and think about how do we do this concerted outreach. So we need to rely on these trusted messengers at this time to ensure that we're getting to these communities.
I think that issue of trust is another common one that's shown up in a few of these questions. Devera, I'll point this one toward you. This person notes that younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, have demonstrated generally less trust in institutions. Does that match up with the polling that you've seen? And how can the government get buy-in from these younger generations to get counted?
Well, certainly what we've seen in our polling is that younger generations are less likely to say they're going to participate. And among the reasons for that are people who have concerns that either that the census is invasive, asking for too much information, or that they don't necessarily trust the government to make the best use of that information. So that's something to go back to what Anita was saying, where the government is trying to counter that by having these so-called trusted messengers, people who are part of the communities that distrustful people are in, and persuade them that the census numbers are worthwhile and that their participation will help make for a better count.
And Anita, have you seen that those efforts are succeeding so far?
I think it's a mixed bag. I think it's still a little early to say. I think one of the measures of success has been the pivot to digital outreach in the midst of the coronavirus, where we've got communities coming together via Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, which I've never used before, but I know it's popular with younger generations, to really be able to get that message out. And it's allowed for creativity. Right? It's allowed for organizations to really think about how that messaging resonates within their communities. So for example, the Latino community it's kind of like a spoof of The View, where they have elected officials, Latino community leaders coming together to talk about and chit-chat about the census and why it's relevant and important. With the African American community, the NAACP has been a real leader in this outreach effort and thinking about how they best message. The Chicago Urban League has been doing a number of webinars to get to their leaders. But again, as I mentioned before, the numbers in Chicago and Cook County are struggling right now. So this is our opportunity to get folks to get counted, right? This is our chance so that we can make a difference for our future.
So I have another question here, again relating to sort of trust and the younger generations. Why should millennials trust the government not to sell their data to corporations or companies willing to pay top dollar for consumer intel? I don't know if either of you want to take that on.
Well, I'll tell you what the Census Bureau will tell you, which is that there are federal laws that will send you to jail if you disclose confidential census numbers. The individual responses to the census are confidential for 72 years. It's tricky. Why 72 years? The thinking is it probably was the average lifespan when the law was passed on this, although it's hard to pin that down for sure. But in any event, your individual data is not supposed to be released for 72 years, and the Census Bureau has a pretty good record since World War II in that regard. Now, there was a notable example of breach of trust during World War II when the Census Bureau disclosed data about individual Japanese Americans so that they could be rounded up and put in camps, for which the Census Bureau later apologized. Quite many years afterward. And a law was passed after that occurred to prohibit that sort of thing from happening again. So the law says that even if another federal agency, for example, ICE or an enforcement agency, asks for your data, the Census Bureau is not allowed to receive it. So, for example, the Census Bureau is getting data from the Homeland Security Department as part of its efforts to use government records to fill in missing data, but it will not give data, it says, to DHS in return.
And Anita, have you found that sort of those messages, those strong guarantees from the Census Bureau have been sort of effective in mollifying some of these concerns about individual data?
In some cases, yes. But that resonates differently from community to community. And I would say that with the census going online for the first time, you have an opportunity for more misinformation and disinformation that is certainly percolating and has been for a while. So I would say that the added layer of protection that we have right now is this confidentiality pledge that has been created nationally amongst census stakeholders. So the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, along with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, put together this pledge, essentially adding another layer of security to say, we've got advocates, we've got attorneys, we've got folks that are in it to win it, who are looking out, who are going to be the eyes and ears to make sure that if there's any funny business that may be coming, that they're at the ready to try to mitigate that. There are hotlines nationally that have been provided for. So if people come across something that looks suspicious, that they can report that. All of this information can be found at censuscounts.org. And then locally, the state of Illinois created a census office with real advocacy from the Illinois Count Me In program and the Rainbow Push Census Coalition, which then allowed for Governor Pritzker and budgeteers to appropriate $29 million for census outreach in Illinois, which is first time for Illinois to be invested in this effort. And so one of the strategies that they've deployed is a texting portal program. It's called the 987-987 program. And this is not just an opportunity to share information about disinformation or misinformation, but it's also a way to engage with communities. And millennials like to text, are very comfortable and savvy with it. So this is a program that I would certainly say look into, reach out to the Illinois Department of Human Services to get more information, because this is a great tool and a way to also engage.
Anita, you've talked a lot about how the Illinois census is unique, really engaged with a lot of these local communities, a lot of these local groups, with a big effort sort of statewide to make sure that Illinois is properly counted. Are other states undertaking similar efforts, or is Illinois unique in that?
I wish we could say we're unique, but I would say that we've taken a real page out of Minnesota and Michigan. Their sense of collaboration is very strong, and it's been a really great role model for us in Illinois to aspire to be stronger together. But I would say that this movement has really taken flight in the last couple of years alone. You see states like Pennsylvania, New York, California. California has always been really great about bringing government and philanthropy together. But they organized early, right? And they blew everyone out of the water when they appropriated more than $100 million for this outreach effort almost 3 years ago.
It's good to know that we're catching up here in Illinois. One other question from the online audience. Devera, I'll point this one to you because we talked earlier a bit about some other international models of census taking. Are there other models that the U.S. could or should learn and benefit from?
Wow. So we at Pew Research Center do not take policy positions, so I can't really say one way or the other. As I said, I do think we're edging more in the direction of using other government records rather than face-to-face interactions. And I'll tell a story from Canada of what happened there. A number of years ago, Canada asked folks in their census, we need your income, and if you like, we can just take it from what you told our treasury, or you can tell us what your income is. And most people checked off that they just wanted the census to take what they'd already told the treasury. And in fact, you hear sometimes people saying, why are you asking for my income or this or that or the other? The government already knows this. Well, now the Canadian census doesn't even ask you how you want your income information taken. It just uses treasury records. And it's possible that after this census, with its expanded use of government records to fill in that missing information, we may end up as more of a government record census than we have been in the past.
Interesting. Certainly the government has lots of data, but I guess it doesn't always talk to the parts that it might want to. Top question, now that we're coming toward the end of this is obviously a global affairs organization, and the top question is how this relates to global affairs. What impact, if any, does the U.S. Census have on our international development or other foreign policies? Any thoughts?
Well, I'll just chime in a little. So the census, what people need to remember is it only asks for very, very basic information, age, sex, Hispanic origin, race. And there is a little bit more in the race question this time. Actually, I probably should have mentioned this when you asked about what's new, where folks who check the white or black box are being asked to supply more detail about their origin. And this may give us a little bit more of a window into some of the immigrant populations from these different racial groups. So that's one thing that might happen. But in addition, of course, we know that the census is the basis for other surveys, government surveys and such, that will tell us more about the immigrant makeup of our nation. And that in turn will tell us about communities here that still have ties to communities back home, or that may have ties to communities back home, or refugee populations and where they are. So it could be the sort of jumping off point for a lot more rich information about some of our foreign-born populations in this country.
And I'll chime in and add that because the census determines political apportionment, it does have some very direct impacts on U.S. politics. So shifting seats out of Illinois will definitely have impacts on how sort of the U.S. House looks in the future. We're almost out of time, but Anita, I wanted to give you sort of the last word on promoting the census. If folks have not yet filled out the census, can you please remind them how important it is and where they can go to do that?
Certainly. So it has never been more crucial than it is amidst this pandemic to get counted. This is an opportunity to ensure our congressional representation, right? As Craig mentioned, this impacts redistricting, and this is giving voice so that when we do have future crises, that we've got accurate data, that we've got emergency data, that we can best help our residents all across the state, but not just the state, all across the country. And so the census can be taken in 3 ways, right? It's not just online. You can call in a response via telephone. The responses are accepted in more than just one language. There are 12 languages outside of English that are provided for. And there is like a callback function. So if you don't want to wait in line, you can give your number and they can call you back. And I'm hearing that this is a popular feature that has been utilized by many communities across the country. And so it was so popular, in fact, on April 1st, which is designated Census Day, that they had to disable that for a short period, but it's back up and running. And then I would say the third way of self-reporting is the tried and true way, the paper copy, which started being mailed to households by the Bureau last week to households that hadn't self-reported yet. But if you're comfortable with digital and you're comfortable going online, please go to 2020census.gov, put in your address or your unique ID that is provided for the Bureau, and get counted.
Thank you so much, Anita Banerjee, Devera Cohn, for joining us on the Council's virtual stage this afternoon. Look forward to seeing all of you again at a future Chicago Council program, online or maybe one day in person again soon.